We are now going to begin the section of notes covering selective permeability and the cell membrane. The cell membrane is called selectively permeable, and this means that only a selected molecules will move through it. Imagine kind of like a fishing net. A fishing net is considered selectively permeable. Permeable is to permeate. Permeate means to go through, and selectively permeable means that only certain things are passing through. So like in a fishing net, the water is allowed to go through, but not the fish. The cell membrane is kind of like that. Certain molecules pass through the membrane without any problem at all. Others aren't allowed to go through the membrane at all. And then there are even a third set that can pass through, but with a little bit of help. You need to know that the smaller molecules can diffuse in or out of the cell through the cell membrane. Remember, we talked about diffusion last week. It's where it's moving from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Larger molecules are able to pass through as well using special transport proteins. Okay, we'll see an image here in just a second of the cell membrane, and we'll be able to see what those transport proteins look like. These special transport proteins allow for something called facilitated diffusion. To facilitate means to help. Okay, so that's just a few side notes that I think you should add to your notes here. You need to know that permeable, to permeate means to go through. And you need to, if you need to put a star next to diffuse to remind you what diffusion is. And then facilitated, you need to put a side note there that to facilitate means to help. So it's diffusion with help. The cell membrane is a double layer of lipid molecules. So double meaning two, lipid molecules. We typically call this the lipid bilayer. Remember, bi means two. So like a bicycle has two wheels, there are two layers of lipids. A lipid bilayer. You need to highlight this, circle it, whatever you need to, because we will refer to the lipid bilayer quite often. There are proteins floating in this lipid bilayer that function as channels or will help the cell communicate with the outside environment. So you see here we have our lipid bilayer. Each of these little blue ball things with the tails on it is a layer of lipids. So we have one lipid layer here and another down here. So see, two layers are lipid bilayer. Here we have proteins going through the lipid bilayer. You see this one is acting as a channel. It's going to allow things to go through that center portion. This one is a pump protein, and we're going to talk about that more in the next set of notes. But you can still see that these proteins are going all the way through the lipid bilayer and allowing for molecules to move into or out of the cell, and that will also allow for communication to happen. All right, we're going to look at the components of the cell membrane. I know I've just kind of pointed some out to you, and you can probably figure out a lot of them on your own. So I'm going to ask that you pause the video here in just a second and try to label these as well as you can. Even if you're not like labeling on your sheet, just think to yourself. There's no risk involved in this. Just pause the video and think to yourself where each of these terms would be labeled on this diagram. Okay, let's see how you did. Here's a transport protein down here on the bottom. You see that's the one that allows the channel. Phospholipids, that might have been a harder one because remember we were calling it the lipid bilayer. You need to know that sometimes they're referred to as phospholipids too. Okay, so a phospholipid is just a single lipid. That would be this little guy right here. Okay, one head with the tails attached to it is one single phospholipid. The next one, though, is the phospholipid bilayer. So the lipid bilayer, you're going to label over here and make sure in your notes that you have drawn that this includes both layers of those lipids. Remember, this is a double layer, so you need to make sure that you've labeled it correctly. Okay, a protein is made of the elements what? Let's see if you can write these down and remember them from the biochemistry unit. All right, you should have written carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. Remember, our symbols come together to make CHON. C-H-O-N are the elements for protein. Okay, now that you know what I'm asking for, why don't you pause the video and see if you can remember the one for lipids. All right, you should have come up with carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. That's right, CH and O. That's all we have in lipids. So our summary question here, why are lipids and proteins important in the cell membrane? I want you to go ahead and pause the video, come back after you have filled in your answer, and we'll see how you did. All right, you should have answered something to the effect of lipids are what make the layer of the cell membrane, and that proteins are important because they allow for the transport of molecules across that cell membrane. Those are the two key points. If you added more, excellent. If you didn't have at least that, you might want to add it into your notes. This concludes this section of the notes. We'll see you back for the next section.